Hi there, and welcome to Considering Comic Books. So, what does that mean exactly? What are we considering? Well, it can mean a lot of things. I'd say the majority will be considerations based on contemporary movements in comics, retrospective glances into the past, reviews, and some interviews. You see, comic books have never had such a vibrant grasp of the Western zeitgeist as they do now. At least not since the post 40s war years or the boom and subsequent bust of the 90s. Right now, comic book movies are making billions in worldwide ticket returns. Black Panther, a great example, broke a billion, and Avengers Infinity War is set to top that gross. So, comic book properties are the hot source of much of our TV and cinema. So the question must be asked, why are book sales nowhere near the heady days of comic book madness from decades past, or are they? Right now, comic books are considered the ground floor of pop culture, yet despite growing cinematic revenue, reports of US comic book shops going out of business in record numbers and rumoured low sales paint a very different picture. At the head of the current controversy is Marvel Comics. Marvel's EIC, Axel Alonso, stepped aside late 2017 after an embattled year for the publisher. The company came under fire for, amongst other things, making Captain America a Nazi, and comments of sales SVP David Gabriel regarding the company's step away from diversity due to fan pressure. Despite a strong year for DC Comics and Image banner publications, we can't help but picture a comicdom that is under pressure at the moment. So, to understand why comic books at least seem to be in trouble, we're going to deep dive and dismantle the factors one by one. To end the article, we'll hear from stats aggregate Comichron helmsman John Jackson Miller for the final word on the state of the industry in 2018. Part 1, Fan vs Artist. The current climate of divisiveness in the comic book readership stems from a combination of what's being deemed forced politically correct subject matter within the titles and the creator-fan interaction via social media forums, and that's most notably Twitter. A combination of comic book content playing on political, gender, sexuality, and race issues, and what's been deemed reader hostility and harassment from the reader end has seen creators taking to social media to defend their positions against a fan demographic that feel these subjects have no place in an entertainment medium. This growing consumer movement of detractors has risen on social media and on YouTube to somewhere in the 70,000 region, and that's over the past 2 years. The movement's figurehead is a former veteran, best known by his YouTube handle, Diversity in Comics. From his debut in 2016, DNC, aka comics creator Richard C. Mayer, has channeled a deep discontent among a core demographic of the readership. This growth shows no sign of slowing down and has funded Mayer's own comic book career to the channel of well over $317,000, the most successful fan-funded book of all time as of this article. So the argument for and against the current creative mandate in comics warrants another essay in itself. But the thrust of the against argument is that propaganda shoehorned into the medium by politically motivated creators is affecting sales, killing the readership, and forcing small stores to close due to an unsellable product, something creators strongly deny. This movement has dubbed itself Comicsgate, which is directly referential to Gamergate, a similar movement from 2014 that centered around the concept of progressivism invading games, ethics in games journalism, and sexism in the industry. Like all movements, it wasn't pure. Claims of harassment and sexism were pervasive, and while advocates claimed these cases were outliers and in some cases fraudulent claims, detractors of the movement were ardent that the abuse was real. And this is similarly the case with Comicsgate. Both sides have taken a hard line, and the waters are no less muddy. For the outsider, this paints a glib picture of comics. But the divide has perhaps broader social connotations than the entertainment medium. It's part of a bigger split, primarily in American thinking, that has, thanks to the internet, spread with viral efficacy. Part 2, the American Schism. The polarization of US society along political lines had been building throughout 2015 and finally reached crisis point on election night 2016. I spoke with a liberal friend of mine the night of, and he genuinely couldn't fathom that Donald Trump could be elected. Thus, Trump's victory and installation as the 45th president of the USA was amidst a wave of liberal hysteria. Liberal America was broken and collectively lost its mind in the now well-documented events following the election. This might seem harsh, but it isn't an unfair statement to make. Similar conservative hysteria afflicted Obama's appointment and dogged both of his terms. Yet now, like never before, American society seems divided along party lines that are less blurred and more permanent. Factions formed and took stock post-Trump. Following the election, the media and political pundits were outraged. The impossible had happened. Social media became abuzz with opinions like never before. We left the age of facts to our forebears and now embrace the opinion piece as the new form of intellectual determination. This was no more so evident than from liberal comic book creators. Art has always attracted the liberally minded, and politics lapped at the undercurrent of any well-remembered piece of comics literature. Comics, it could be argued, were born in politics. Politics, as the saying goes, is downwind of culture. 30 Superman, for example, was a socialist at heart, fighting banksters and corrupt politicians. Wonder Woman, while an Amazonian princess on the surface, began as a statement of emancipation for 50s housewives. Spider-Man had the power of a radioactive spider, the proportionate power of a spider, and could sling webs. It was an adventure story, but it could also be argued Spider-Man is an analogue for responsibility and gun control. And that's before we even consider the flag-waving propagandist sentiment of Captain America at his inception. So the nuance of yesteryear, that a story could be both an adventure yarn and a political statement at heart, was abandoned for a strident comic book gerrymandering of a moral variety. Pre-Trump, creators had tempered their desires for the brazenly political, rare exceptions like Spiegelman's Mouse, Moore's V for Vendetta, or Claremont's God Loves, Man Kills aside. Comic books were largely commercial adventure stories, yarns about heroes and villains engaged in ultimate battles of good versus evil. They were at best politically philosophical, suggesting that readers apply thought to their work as opposed to telling them how to think. So, when 2016's creatives took a hard line on what they believed and how they wanted people to think, Twitter feeds doubling as pulpits for political effrontery, and comic book characters acting as avatars for bluntly injected opinion pieces, well, the conservative element of the readership took notice. The road to Comicsgate had begun to pave. Part 3, the numbers don't lie. With on-running controversy, fan-creator infighting of the most vicious variety, and digital companies like Amazon's Comixology now dominating a substantial share in the market, print retailers would, on the surface, seem to have suffered. over 50 stores closing in the North American market as of 2017, according to a January 2018 Bleeding Cool article, spoke of a pastime in crisis. Comicsgate would seem to have a strong point if these retailers' closing was indeed due to falling sales in a market saturated with biased opinion pieces in place of meat and potatoes comics that told good stories. So the only way to truly understand what's happening in comics is to look at the numbers. A cursory glance at Comichron, the statistics aggregate for sales across comics, graphic novels, and digital in North America, rather than painting a glib picture, shows a healthy market. Steady growth since 2011 shows dollar sales going from $266 million in 2010 to a peak $382 million in 2016. There was a shortfall of $36 million in 2017, but that's not unheard of after some years of continued market growth. Though it is a substantially larger shortfall than the usual $10 million, give or take, throughout the 2010s. Allegations of Marvel's over-shipping policy in 2017 that attempted to level market share using a units shipped vs units sold tactic had been suggested as a reason many comic shops buckled under the strain. It also made it untenable for readers to keep up with many series due to the crossover aspect built into many of the events. That led to both frustrated finances and event fatigue. While DC relaunched their line in a more succinct fashion, Marvel pumped out more content. Regardless of how you feel about this as a consumer, the reality made for an extremely profitable year for Marvel, one of their most profitable in fact. But was it at the cost of fans and retailers? One man who'd know more about the numbers than anyone else is Comichron's John Jackson Miller. The author and comic book statistician took some of my questions to shine further light on the comic book market in 2018. The interview will be read by me as it was conducted over email, so I will be reading the part of John Jackson Miller also. Here's the interview below. Considering comic books, there's talk in certain circles that the industry is in trouble regards comic book sales, print in particular. What would be your analysis? John Jackson Miller. I wrote back in 2012 that the comic book industry is the healthiest part of the magazine industry because comics are sold non-returnably, are the magazines people don't throw away and have a second life as books which can potentially keep earning indefinitely. There aren't many non-comics magazines people would pay for collected editions of, and not many prose novels people would buy chapter by chapter as they come out, but we lucked into that position. 2017 was a down year, it's true, but that was coming off of 6 years of growth, so a slowdown was going to happen sooner or later. As a billion-dollar industry, the business has enough different facets too that the pictures vary. Sales were down less in the book channel, and kids' graphic novels were slightly up. 2017 was slower for new comic sales in the direct market, and that led to sluggish graphic novel sales because there just weren't as many must-have books. As of April, the first third of the year has had more than cut in half 2017's pace of loss. So we'll see how things are once summer gets rolling. 2018 has so far had 7 comics sell over 150,000 copies. We only had 9 in all of 2017. Considering comic books, have you noticed any sales practices from publishers like over-shipping, say, used to gain larger shares in the market? John Jackson Miller. There are always varying tactics that publishers use to expose titles to new readers, but generally no publisher will lose money just to make a splash on a sales chart. That's not really how publishing works. Marvel has tried overships to get retailers' fans to sample specific books. DC came at the same thing a different way by offering returnability in the Rebirth launch. Both are methods to get copies in front of potential readers. They just differ in the logistics and where on the balance sheet the extra issues wind up. Like any tactic, it works until it doesn't, which is why you see publishers tweaking their programs all the time. Considering comic books. A sizable portion of shops closing in 17, over 50 as of 2018, seems to indicate a market decline. How much of this do you think is due to the aforementioned sale practices from publishers, bad sales practices from shop owners, the encroaching digital market, or simple customer drop-off due to falling interest? John Jackson Miller. That 50+ figure from 2017 came from a bleeding cool article which explicitly didn't attempt to count the number of stores that opened in the year. The number of openings is unknown, but it does appear to have covered some portion of the loss. If the one report I heard of a 1% contraction is correct, that'd put the net loss into the 20s. That said, one of the things I heard quite a lot from retailers is that local or store-specific conditions were behind quite a few of the closures. Often everyone will hear about a high-profile store closing, and then we will find out lower in the story that the store's trouble sprang from what made it high-profile, which is usually a well-known location where urban rents are skyrocketing. Often those are things that might have happened anyway, or that a store might have survived in a year that wasn't slow. There's always a certain amount of churn, you just don't always hear about it. Digital appears to have been almost wholly additive, taking nothing away from print sales. In every year this decade that digital sales went up in dollar terms, print did too. Considering comic books. How much has pricing got to do with the current numbers? For example, is growth based on large market consumption, or are sales lower bolstered by high pricing? John Jackson Miller. Direct market customers have historically shown less price resistance than comic buyers anywhere else. The cost of comics has actually not changed that much this decade. People forget that the average price of comics has been above $3.50 for almost 10 years. Going back to when DC boosted prices to $3.99 the first time, unit sales of comics went up 6 out of 7 years this decade. Probably only one of those up years, 2016, is one where I'd attribute any roll to cost, as DC had rolled back to $2.99 again. Considering comic books. Finally, the 90s is credited as the boom and bust of comics, but even earlier years have cited as having massive sales in comics. Nearly 3 decades on, how are comics faring as an industry based on sales? John Jackson Miller. As said at the top, there are a lot of things that make comics a special market where success sometimes isn't measured solely by the bottom line. Not many other kinds of printed entertainment media have comics potential for licensing, for example, and the back issue market for comics is believed to be in the 9 figures annually. The fact that we do have graphic novels and digital supplementing comic sales and taking the pressure off the individual issues to be the sole profit center is part of why a lot of people feel that the business is on firmer foundation now versus 20 years ago. Things could change because the industry's nearly collapsed 3 times, but I would take the odds that, as before, we'd find some way to innovate our way out of it. Comics teach us all about daring escapes. So here's my final thoughts. In closing, comic books may not be in the dire straits that are being reported. In fact, quite the opposite. Does that mean that critics are wrong to demand more from for their consumer dollar? Of course not. Critics complain because they love something, not because they hate it. If you love something, then you're clearly invested in it. you want to spend your money on it, you want to have good product. So criticism and complaint isn't always necessarily a bad thing. But does that mean that creators are wrong to defend their positions in fan interactions? Also, it's a case of course not. In most cases, creators are freelancers. They work for a large company and their opinions are their own. But they also have to take into consideration their demographic, their target demographic, and if they want to succeed or not at a consumer level with a broader audience. If you've got a small demographic and they will buy your books and they don't mind non-professional interactions, then fine. But if you want to sell to a bigger audience, then you have to adhere to a more professional standard. That is just the rules of business. What people choose to spend their money on can be seen in the success and failures of the titles that come out and bust out every month. It can also be seen in the rising trend in crowdfunded campaigns with former industry pros like Brian Pulido's Lady Death Kickstarter, and now Diversity in Comics' Richard C. Mayer with his Jawbreakers Lost Souls Kickstarter. Both of these Kickstarters, Indiegogo in Mr. Mayer's case, have cracked the $250,000 mark. Jawbreakers is the highest grossing indie crowdfunder of all time as of this video. So one thing is for sure, as it stands, the comic book industry is robust and adaptable, and there is an abundance of people who want to spend money on comics. And 2018 is shaping up to be a very good year.